4 chairs, 4 people, and 4 perspectives. We'll encounter each one of these, well, kinda, in the text that we're going to engage today. So if you have a Bible, would you open it to Mark chapter 5? Mark chapter 5. If you're unfamiliar with your New Testament, this one's going to be easy. Find Matthew, and the next one's Mark. If you hit Luke, hang a left. Mark 5. This is one of the most unique, odd, frankly, creepy text in the entire New Testament. This one will leave you scratching your head a little bit, just to be honest. 4 chairs, 4 people, 4 perspectives. And we're going to go ahead and call them Susie, Simon, Jimmy, and Jesus. So Susie, Simon, Jimmy, and Jesus, we're going to interact with them today. One of them is named in the text, 2 are there for sure, and 1 represents some folks who are there that we don't know their names. And I'm giving them names for a reason. When we read about, the townspeople or this or that, it's important to realize these are regular folks. These are folks with jobs. These are folks that pay bills. These are folks that have families. These are folks that make choices, and oftentimes we just read past like they're a mass, and we don't realize that these are actually individuals. So Susie, our first chair, she represents the town folks. So we're just going to say her and her friend, or her and her husband, they run a barbecue business in town. Romans like their pork. And she's not too concerned about the odd Jews that live on the other side of the lake. She's not particularly religious, but she lives in a region called the Decapolis, and that means there's 10 towns there, 10 Roman towns. There's a Roman garrison, it means there's Roman military there. 10 towns, so she pays homage to the Roman gods. She has to. That's the way that works. She goes about life there, paying her taxes, minding her business. Second chair is Simon. Simon is a real person. Now, when we say Simon, I'm not talking about Simon Peter, even though Simon is a disciple of Jesus. There was a second Simon, Simon the Zealot. We'll mention it, and that tells us a lot about who he is. He's a real person. He's not like Susie at all. He's very, very religious. Simon, he trains as a fighter. He's a zealot. He's a patriot. He's willing to die at a moment's notice. He's willing to spill Roman blood, and frankly yours, to get rid of Rome. That's the way he thinks, to protect his beloved Israel. And honestly, Simon's got to be pretty confused right now. The night before, I imagine he was downright upset. Oh, remember, Jesus had been teaching on the other side of the lake. And honestly, everyone wanted him there. He was getting really popular. Folks were crowding in, and Jesus says the oddest of things. Great, everyone's excited, we're leaving. That's not the way you build a church. He says, we're taking off. And where they're going to is the oddest part. They're going to Roman towns. There's no reason for them to go there. There'd be no reason for a decent religious Jewish person to ever go to the Decapolis. There's nothing but Gentiles there. The only reason Simon would want to go there would be to pick a fight. He may even been one of the guys that in the boat. Remember when the storm kicked up? He may have been one of the guys that barked at Jesus. Said, don't you even care? Don't you care that we're dying? Well, but then Jesus woke up. Remember in the storm, we looked at this last week. Remember Jesus woke up. That was all next level stuff. What happened there? And then Susie, Simon, we've got to keep track of our chairs. Susie, Simon, Jimmy. Now, I've clearly made up the name Jimmy. He'll be described as a man with an unclean spirit. Now, when we read that unclean spirit, what that doesn't mean that Jimmy's done some things that just have made him feel dirty. That's not what's happening here. This means there is something ancient and terrible living inside of him. The parasite has overtaken the host. he has a demon in him, or better, or more accurately, demons living in him. Jimmy lives a literal hell. Now, we could go down all sorts of rabbit trails here on talking about demons and all that. Suffice to say for now is they are real and they are terrible beyond imagination. I've talked to folks who have worked in this area much more than I have, and they say, hey, throw out everything you know and just picture darkness and filth and cold and depressing, and that's what you have. It's awful. And poor Jimmy lives in it. But then the last chair, well, is Jesus. Susie, Simon, Jimmy, Jesus. Jesus is God's chosen answer to the problem. Jesus is the true king. He's always walking away from crowds, even when they seem to love him. He's always looking for individuals. And he always seems to be sifting his disciples. 4 chairs, 4 people, 4 perspectives. And it may be that as we encounter the text today that you identify with one of those. So if you don't mind, allow me, I'm just going to teach through this text for a few minutes. And then we're going to come back to these chairs and look at this text from their perspective. Mark 5, verse 1. They came to the other side of the sea, to the region of the Gerasenes. As soon as they got out of the boat, a man with an unclean spirit came out of the tombs and met him. He lived in the tombs, and no one was able to restrain him anymore, not even with a chain, because he often had been bound with shackles and chains, but he'd torn the chains apart and smashed the shackles. No one was strong enough to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always crying out and cutting himself with stones. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and knelt before him, and he cried out with a loud voice, what do you have to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I beg you, before God, don't torment me. For he had told him, come out of the man, you unclean spirit. What is your name? He asked him. My name is Legion, he answered him, because we are many. And he begged him earnestly not to send him out of the region. You just look at this scene. What an odd scene. From Simon's perspective, remember the disciples came across the lake in the boat, the storm. I can't imagine that anyone was in a very good mood this morning. They're tired. They just rode out this incredible storm. They've been up all night. They're soaked to the bone. It's been terrible. Somebody probably barfed. I bet it was Matthew. And here they show up, and they get out of the boat, and this thing, comes crawling out of the tombs. It's like something from a movie. Seriously, when you look at this guy, the town folks don't know what to do with him. His family doesn't know what to do with him. He'd clearly been a nuisance, or at least maybe they tried. And finally they gave up and said, we just can't help anymore. Why else would you try to chain a man up? But that didn't work because there's something different about it. He's breaking chains, and I picture him with, chains and stuff hanging off. Remember Jacob Marley? That's kind of the vision that I get. This guy's living this. The word there says no one is able to subdue him. That in the original language has to do with no one was able to tame this wild animal. That's what they're saying about him. And I imagine he just terrified people. Filthy, dark, mutilated, untamable. And we like scenes in the New Testament. We like the scenes where Jesus says, let the little children come to me. Those are great scenes. Those scenes make us smile. We like the scenes where Jesus takes a kid's Happy Meal and feeds the whole county. We like those. But this scene, honestly, it's just weird. And it's downright confusing. And when you see it, because honestly, I don't think we even see it right. When you read in verse 6, that it says that he comes and bows down to Jesus, we tend to think, oh, well, he's coming and paying homage because he recognizes who Jesus is. But that's not what's happening. Notice it says, pay attention to the tenses here. Jesus had already said, come out of the man, and this demon then runs up to Jesus. There's an odd thing in the ancient world. I talked about this a few chapters back. There's an odd thing about naming someone and seeming to have the upper hand. Those of you who are familiar with your Old Testament, do you remember when Jacob was suddenly attacked by that mysterious wrestler? Guy comes out, Jacob says, I won't let go until you tell me what your name is. There's this idea of having the upper hand here, and that's what's happening here. This demon says, what do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High? In other words, we've got your number. We know what you're up to. What are you doing here? Now, you're not come to torment us. They're trying to play spiritual chess. Now, before we get too judgy here, we tend to play spiritual chess as well, or at least spiritual checkers. Have you ever played this game, God, if you will, I will? Oh, if you just give me this job, I'd start to tithe. Lord, if you just fix this relationship, then I would quit, or I would this. This idea of, hey, if you'll do this, I'll do that. See, we fall into the same category, trying to manipulate God. And here are two spiritual powers standing face to face on their turf. In the original language, there's a lot of military terminology here. Mark wants us to know this is a battle. And Jesus will have none of it. He says, what's your name? Oh, my name is Legion, because we are many. Oh, we don't tend to deal much with that world, but a legion is 6,000 foot soldiers and 120 horsemen. 6,000 foot soldiers and 120 horsemen. Whatever's inside of this man is large and awful. Awful. It's an act of grace that he hasn't died at this point. This poor man lived a literal hell. Look at verse 11, because this is where it even gets weirder. If you thought we'd gotten weird before, now it's going to go next level. A large herd of pigs was there feeding on this hillside. The demons, notice now it's turned to plural. The demons begged him, send us to the pigs so that we may enter them. So he gave them permission. And the unclean spirits came out and entered the pigs, and a herd of about 2,000 rushed down a steep bank into the sea and drowned there. And the men who tended them ran off and reported it to the town and the countryside. And people went to see what happened. And they came to Jesus and saw the man who had been demon-possessed sitting there, dressed in his right mind, and they were afraid. Literally, it says they were terrified. Those who had seen it described to them what had happened to the demon-possessed man, and told about the pigs. Then they began to beg him, to beg Jesus, that is, to leave their region. You look at this and you go, what a strange scene. Forgive me, I still have an 8th grader's mind, so I just tend to see a bunch of pigs dancing like bobbers in the lake. And I go, what an odd scene. Just what'd that have to smell like a few days later? All of these waterlogged, rotten demon bacon pigs. Honestly, that was a sentence I figured I'd never write. But loads of questions pop up here as you read this text. Why? How? Can I say this? If you think you have this figured out, let me gently say I doubt it. This is a pretty complex thing. I've read all the best scholars on this, and I read them all, and then I go, There's just a lot of questions that come up here. But here's why that's not important. If we're staring at the pigs, we've missed the miracle. If we're trying to figure out what's happened over here, we're missing what's really happened. Jesus just went to war, and at his very word, he defeated a legion of demons. At his word, a legion of demons takes off. If you ever get a chance to meet Jimmy in heaven, You can ask him about it. Now the town folks start showing up. And it's just like at the end of chapter 4. If you remember at the end of chapter 4 with this whole storm thing, the storm, and the disciples wake up and it says they're afraid. Jesus calls them cowards. And then Jesus calms the storm, and then what? They're terrified. Well, just a few verses later, now we've got into another situation where there's this untamable demon, and Jesus, at his word, says, that's enough of that. And now all the people are, again, terrified. Side note, if our vision of Jesus is so watered down that fear has no place, we may need to reread the New Testament again. If our vision of God is so watered down that we've domesticated Jesus, we may need to pause and reread these again. C.S. Lewis wrote in the Chronicles of Narnia, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, he's not a tame lion. So we have two situations where folks are terrified at what Jesus does, and the response is what changes everything, because the disciples lean into that and they stand close to Jesus. The townsfolk, Susie, begs him to leave. Because here the townspeople are more frightened by Jesus' power over the demons than they are by the demons themselves. This isn't the way that you want this scene to end. When you read this, you expect the disciples to be wading out in, move all the pigs away so we can do the baptisms. But it doesn't end that way. It ends with them begging Jesus to take off. Now, what does happen in the next few verses is incredibly important. Look at verse 18. As Jesus was getting into the boat, remember the people in the background are begging him to leave. As he's getting into the boat, the man who'd been demon-possessed begged him earnestly that he might remain with him. Jesus didn't let him, but told him, go to your own people and report to them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you. So he went out and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and they were all amazed. I imagine that had to be hard for Jimmy to hear. Jesus had just done so much for him, and he says, hey, I want to go. And Jesus says, no, why don't you go home? Why don't you go home? And this man who had literally lived hell goes home there afterwards and becomes the very first missionary to the Gentiles. The very first missionary here in the book of Mark to go to Gentiles, our people. Let's back up and let's look at these chairs for just a minute. Because this scene, although it is strange, is incredibly important. So let's start with Susie, our town representative, because we all know folks like Susie. She hates the state of things, but honestly, she's more comfortable making sure that the darkness is kept to the side, kind of out of the way. She's more comfortable with that than she is with the one who can make the darkness leave. You see, because dealing with Jesus for Susie is going to mean that she's going to have to be vulnerable. Dealing with Jesus is going to mean that she's going to have to open the closets and let him in. And that gets very personal and very scary, so it's easier to ask him to go. And I know what we think because we have friends and family who don't know Jesus as Lord, and we just want him to. And, they've been around, they've seen God do things, but it's easier to ask him to go. And we think they just need more evidence. Can I say this, and just let me be completely transparent. I've spent a lot of time coming up with answers to questions no one was asking. I just have. Most of the time, it's not evidence that folks need. We like to be able to provide all the answers to the questions, but more often than not, Susie has a heart issue. And can I just say this? Love her. Be patient. Be kind. live a life that reflects the good work that God's done in your life. And when you have the opportunity, then speak a good word about what Jesus has done for you. But if we come up with the idea that what we have to do is win an argument, what we end up doing is just pushing Susie away on a permanent basis. She's not the only chair, though. Simon. Now, of all the 12, I picked Simon on purpose. For Simon, this entire scene has to be an absolute joke because they shouldn't be there, right? A good religious person doesn't go across to the Decapolis. They don't go to that neighborhood. They shouldn't be talking to the Gentiles. They shouldn't be near the tombs. They shouldn't be near anything that's dead. The only thing that good happens for him is all the pigs die. That's the only thing about this that he likes. Of the 12, I chose him for this reason, is because we live in a very angry time. We live in a very angry time, and we are all ready to fight most of the time these days. We're ready to fight. We might not use words like Gentile and unclean, but we sure do have our terms that divide us, right? They're this, they're that. And we use those as dividers. And I imagine that Simon learned at least two very important lessons that day. And perhaps I need to be reminded of this as well, and perhaps you do too. And the first one is this, is Jesus' authority knows no bounds. There is no nationality, no race, no political party, no socio-economical barrier that stands outside of his direct authority. There is one king. His name is Jesus. His kingdom does not come with borders. We follow him. Where he goes, we go. What he does, we do. Who he loves, we love. That's the end of that story. And our task is not to make them, whoever them is, because I imagine if we polled each one of us, the thems might be different folks. Our task is not to make them look more like us. Our task is for both of us to look more like Jesus. Our task is for both sides to look more like Jesus. That's the first lesson. The second lesson is this. Ephesians 6:2, Paul writes, "For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against rulers and against authorities, against cosmic powers of this darkness, against evil spiritual forces in the heavens." We have to get this. There is a spiritual battle going on. And we engage in it as representatives of Jesus Christ. That means that his ways become our ways. His purposes become our purposes. I feel like we could spend a lot of time there, but we really need to get to this next chair. This next chair, Jimmy, the demoniac turned disciple. Honestly, Jimmy is the perfect picture of discipleship. He goes from an entire train wreck to sitting at the feet of Jesus in his right mind. That's just his story. And there's something super important here. When Jimmy gets saved, he immediately wants to follow Christ. Jesus, where you go, I go. You know, we sang that song. Who you love, I love. I'm following you. I'm standing right next to you. And Jesus says, oh, that sounds great, except I've got a different plan. I want you to go home. Come again? Jesus says, no, go home. See, this is where this strikes me, is we always tend to think, what's next? What's bigger? What's the bigger thing that I can do? And Jesus, because here, let's be honest, we lionize those things. Oh, that's awesome. They've got this ministry. They're doing this. We lionize those big things, but Jesus says, go home, tell your people what the Lord's done. The normal work of the disciple is to love the people directly around us. It's not to take off and start looking for that next ministry. How about we just go home, start loving in our homes, in the places where we work, in the places where we hang out, where we live, work, and play? How about we just go and reflect Jesus there? That is the normative process of discipleship. But then there's one last chair. It's Jesus. Think about this scene. Think about just the fear that had to go on. And here's Jesus, always in control, always purposeful, always sifting and pushing his followers, testing them, trying to get them to grow and to rely on him more. Really, I've gone through this text before, but it didn't hit me until this week when I was studying this. He's actually living out those parables he taught. Remember that parable he taught about the man who had 100 sheep? One of them wandered off. Jesus is actually living that right here. He got all kinds of folks on the other side of the lake, but he goes here for this one. Or he told a parable right after that about a lost coin, right? Remember the gal that loses one coin and she tears apart the whole house looking for this one coin and then throws a party because she's found it. Jimmy was the coin. Here's Jesus. Lost coin, lost sheep, lost son. You know, it strikes me because... I grew up with the Muppets on TV, and, you got Miss Piggy, and then we watched Charlotte's Web, and you've got pig. And here you read this, and 2,000 pigs die, and you're like, man, I kind of feel bad for the pigs. Here's Jesus, and at the sight of a man who is living no kind of life at all, is living a literal hell. Think of the lengths that he's willing to go for this man. He's willing to allow this whole herd to be destroyed just so he could bring this man healing. Just so he could bring him healing. He's willing to risk it all. But it seems like there should be one more. One more chair. Because it's easy to look around and to say, oh, this guy was this or this guy was that. But the reality is that my life looks a lot more like Jimmy's. C.S. Lewis wrote, before his conversion, listen to this sentence. He had a way with words. My life was a zoo of lusts, a bedlam of ambitions, a nursery of fears, a harem of fondled hatreds. My name was Legion. Let that sink in. Because here, if we look at Legion, we look at Jimmy in this poor chair, the reality is that there's nothing that he could do to save himself. Jesus steps in, removes him from the situation and brings him health and brings him life and brings him hope and brings him a future. And if we're honest and we look at our own lives, Jesus did the same thing with every one of us. There was nothing that I could do. But while we were still dead in our sins, Christ, think about it. We're him. And what Jimmy, the reality is the text doesn't say that he did anything to deserve that. But if I look in the mirror, I know what I've done. I know what I've done. And I imagine if you look in the mirror, you know what you have as well. But at Jesus' word, we receive life and hope and a future and an identity because he's the king. And when we look at the Susies of the world, I didn't mean to point at Dan Bradley. If we look at the Susies of the world, the reality is that hope is there for anyone who will trust him. That's why we call it good news. That's why it's worth sharing. That's why he's worth singing to. Let's stand.